In the spring of 2012, Layla Williams, a corrections officer with 5 years of experience, arrived at a maximum security prison in Leflore County, Mississippi. The facility, a sprawling fortress of concrete and steel, stood isolated amid the swampy fields that stretched endlessly under a gray sky. The air carried the damp weight of the nearby Mississippi Delta, a constant reminder of the region's unforgiving humidity. Layla had spent her career in a women's correctional facility where routines were predictable and the inmates, though challenging, operated within a familiar dynamic. Now, stepping into the men's block, she faced a world of heightened tension where every glance and gesture held potential for conflict. The prison's exterior, weathered by years of rain and neglect, loomed over her as she crossed the gravel lot toward the main gate. Razor wire glinted faintly in the weak sunlight, curling atop the high fences like a warning etched into the landscape. Inside, the corridors echoed with the clang of metal doors and the distant shouts of inmates. The smell of bleach hung heavy, a sharp undercurrent to the musty odor of confinement. Layla adjusted her uniform, the dark blue fabric stiff against her skin, and followed the head warden, Edwin Crow, through the maze of hallways. Crow, a wiry man in his late 50s, carried himself with the precision of someone who had spent decades enforcing order. His eyes, shadowed by deep lines, betrayed a weariness that contrasted with his clipped, authoritative stride. As they moved deeper into the prison, Layla took in her surroundings with a practiced eye. The walls, painted a dull institutional gray, bore faint scratches and scuff marks, traces of lives contained within. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sterile glow that did little to warm the space. Inmates watched from behind the bars of their cells, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Some leaned against the walls, arms crossed, sizing her up as the new officer. Others ignored her entirely, lost in the monotony of their sentences. Layla kept her expression neutral, her posture straight, aware that any sign of uncertainty could be exploited in a place like this. Crow led her to Block D, a high-security wing reserved for those convicted of violent crimes. The air here felt denser, as if the weight of the inmates' past pressed against the walls. The block was quieter than the general population areas, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of a bunk or the shuffle of feet. Layla's boots echoed on the polished concrete floor, each step amplifying her presence. She scanned the cells, noting the sparse furnishings: a metal bunk, a sink, a toilet, and a small shelf for personal items. Most inmates kept their spaces orderly, a necessity in a world where control was scarce. Her attention caught on cell 204, where a man sat at a narrow desk, his head bent over a notebook. Unlike the others, he seemed absorbed in his task, his hand moving steadily as he sketched. His frame was lean, his movements deliberate, exuding a calm that stood out sharply against the block's undercurrent of unrest. Layla lingered for a moment, observing the way his fingers gripped the pencil, the faint rhythm in his posture, as if he were humming a tune only he could hear. The nameplate beside the cell read, Kyle Thompson, and something about his solitude sparked an unbidden curiosity in her. She quickly averted her gaze, reminding herself to stay detached, but the image of him lingered as she continued down the corridor. Crow paused at the end of the block, turning to face her. His briefing was thorough, laying out the protocols that governed Block D. Inmates here required constant vigilance, he explained, their crimes ranging from murder to armed robbery. Personal boundaries were non-negotiable. Familiarity with prisoners could unravel discipline faster than any overt rebellion. Layla nodded, absorbing the rules while her mind cataloged the environment. The weight of her keys, clipped to her belt, grounded her, a reminder of her authority and responsibility. Yet as Crow spoke, her thoughts drifted back to the man in cell 204, his quiet focus an anomaly in the chaos of the prison. After the tour, Layla settled into the staff room, a cramped space with faded posters and a coffee machine that sputtered more than it poured. The other officers, a mix of veterans and newer recruits, greeted her with curt nods. She sensed their wariness, the unspoken question of whether she could handle the demands of Block D. Ignoring the undercurrent, she pulled up the inmate files on a shared computer, her fingers hesitating before typing Kyle Thompson's name. His record appeared on the screen, a stark summary of a life derailed. At 32, he was serving a 15-year sentence for armed robbery and assault. The details painted a grim picture. A botched heist at a convenience store, a struggle that left a clerk injured. Yet buried in the file were fragments of another story, a community college dropout who had once played saxophone in local jazz bands, a man whose dreams of music had crumbled under financial strain. Layla leaned back in her chair, the hum of the staff room fading as she pieced together the contradictions. The file included a mugshot, Kyle's face set in a neutral expression, his eyes sharp and unyielding. She studied the image longer than necessary, searching for clues to the man she had glimpsed in cell 204. His past hinted at ambition, a life that might have unfolded differently under other circumstances. She closed the file abruptly, chastising herself for lingering on one inmate when dozens demanded her attention. The prison demanded focus, not fascination, and she resolved to keep her curiosity in check. As evening fell, Layla left the prison, the heavy gate clanging shut behind her. The Mississippi air clung to her skin, thick with the scent of wet earth and distant pines. She drove her pickup truck along the winding roads, the prison silhouette shrinking in her rearview mirror. Her apartment, a modest one-bedroom on the edge of Greenwood, waited in silence. Sitting at her kitchen table, she sipped coffee and replayed the day's impressions. The faces of the inmates blurred together, but Kyle's stood out, his quiet intensity a puzzle she couldn't quite dismiss. She pushed the thought aside, turning on the radio to fill the emptiness, but a faint unease settled in her chest, as if the prison's walls had followed her home. Layla's first weeks in Block D settled into a rhythm, but the prison's pulse never let her fully relax. Assigned to oversee the workshop in late spring, she found herself in a cavernous room filled with the hum of saws and the scent of sawdust. The workshop, tucked in a corner of the prison's industrial wing, was where inmates repaired furniture for state offices, tables, chairs, and cabinets worn down by years of use. The space buzzed with activity, tools clattering as men worked under the watchful eyes of officers. Layla stood at the entrance, her clipboard in hand, scanning the room for any hint of trouble. Inmates moved with purpose, their focus a fragile balance between productivity and the ever-present threat of discipline. Kyle Thompson was among them, stationed at a workbench near the back. His hands moved with precision, sanding a chair leg with steady, practiced strokes. Layla noticed him immediately, his posture distinct from the others, less guarded, almost at ease. She walked the rows, checking each inmate's progress, but her steps slowed as she approached Kyle's station. His work was meticulous, the wood smooth under his touch, free of the hasty flaws she often saw in others' efforts. She made a note on her clipboard, a routine acknowledgement, but her gaze lingered on the faint scars across his knuckles, marks of a life she could only guess at. Days passed, and Layla's visits to the workshop grew more frequent. She justified it as diligence, ensuring the tools were accounted for, the inmates compliant. But deep down, she knew her attention gravitated toward Kyle. He never challenged her authority, never pushed the boundaries like some inmates who tested new officers with sly remarks or subtle defiance. Instead, he worked quietly, his focus broken only by the occasional hum of a melody, a fragment of jazz or blues that seemed to rise unbidden. One afternoon, as she stood nearby, she caught the tune clearly, a soulful strain that reminded her of late-night radio in her childhood home. The sound stirred something in her, a nostalgia she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Layla began to linger near Kyle's bench, her inspection stretching longer than necessary. She watched the way he handled the tools, his fingers deft despite the roughness of the task. His presence was a quiet anchor in the workshop's chaos, and she found herself drawn to it. One day, as she checked his work, she noticed him pause, his head tilted slightly as if sensing her scrutiny. He resumed sanding, but the moment felt charged, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. She moved on quickly, her pulse quickening, aware that she had crossed an invisible line by letting her attention settle too long. The workshop became her refuge, a place where the prison's weight felt lighter. Kyle's melodies grew familiar, each one a thread pulling her closer. She started to anticipate them, catching herself humming the same tunes on her drive home. One evening, as the inmates lined up to return to their cells, Kyle handed her a folded piece of paper, his movements swift and discreet. She slipped it into her pocket without looking, her training screaming to report it, but curiosity won out. Later, alone in her apartment, she unfolded it to find a pencil sketch of the Mississippi River, its banks lined with willows under a setting sun. The detail was striking, each stroke deliberate, capturing the water's ripple with an artist's care. She tucked the drawing into a drawer, telling herself it meant nothing, but the gesture lingered in her thoughts. Layla's shifts in the workshop stretched beyond her assigned hours. She volunteered for extra duties, claiming the workload demanded it, though her colleagues raised eyebrows at her eagerness. The other officers preferred the control room or perimeter patrols, leaving the workshop's monotony to her. She welcomed it, finding excuses to check Kyle's station, to stand close enough to see the sweat bead on his brow as he worked. His presence was a quiet rebellion against the prison's gray sameness, and she clung to it, unaware of how deeply it was rooting in her. The prison's psychologist, Martha Reed, noticed the change. During a break in the staff room, she watched Layla over a cup of coffee, her eyes sharp with concern. Martha had seen officers burn out or falter under the prison's strain, and Layla's frequent workshop shifts stood out. She approached Layla later, her tone gentle but pointed, reminding her of the dangers of blurring lines with inmates. Layla brushed it off, insisting she was fine, her voice steady but her hands fidgeting with her keys. She told herself she was in control, that her interest in Kyle was harmless, a distraction from the grind of her job. But at night, as she lay in bed, her mind replayed his sketch, his melodies, the way his eyes met hers for a fleeting second before looking away. Kyle's work in the workshop remained impeccable, his output surpassing others. Layla noted it in her reports, her handwriting precise, but her thoughts wandered as she wrote. She began to see him not as inmate 204, but as the man who had once played saxophone in smoky New Orleans clubs, who sketched rivers with a tenderness that seemed impossible in this place. The prison's rules, so rigid in her early days, started to feel like suggestions, bendable in the quiet moments when she stood near him. She caught herself imagining his life before the bars, late nights under stage lights, the freedom of a world she had never known. The thought was intoxicating, a dangerous escape from the life she led. As weeks turned into months, Layla's routine revolved around the workshop. She memorized Kyle's schedule, aligning her shifts to match his. The other inmates faded into the background, their faces a blur compared to his. She noticed small things, the way he rolled his shoulders after a long task, the faint smile that appeared when he hummed. Each detail built a picture she couldn't unsee, one that made the prison's walls feel less absolute. The drawing in her drawer became a talisman, a secret she carried through the gray corridors. She told herself it was nothing, a fleeting connection in a place that starved the soul, but her heart raced when she passed cell 204, knowing he was there, sketching or humming, waiting for their paths to cross again. As summer draped Leflore County in oppressive heat, the prison workshop became Layla's world, its walls both a cage and a sanctuary. The air inside grew stifling, thick with the scent of varnish and sweat, but she barely noticed, her focus narrowing to the moments she shared with Kyle. Their connection, once confined to glances and subtle gestures, had deepened into something undeniable, a pull that defied the prison's rigid boundaries. Layla moved through her shifts with a heightened awareness, her senses attuned to Kyle's presence. His quiet hums, the way his hands shaped wood, the flicker of his eyes when they met hers across the room. The workshop offered pockets of privacy, blind spots where cameras failed to reach. Layla learned these corners instinctively, mapping them as she patrolled the rows of workbenches. A storage closet at the far end, its door half hidden by stacks of lumber, became their refuge. During breaks, when other inmates lingered near the water cooler or shuffled back to their tasks, Layla and Kyle slipped into these shadows. Their encounters were brief, measured in stolen seconds, but each touch carried the weight of forbidden fire. Her fingers brushed his arm, his hand grazed her waist, and in those fleeting moments, the prison's gray reality dissolved. She felt a rush she hadn't known in years, a pulse of life that drowned out the clang of metal gates and the drone of routine. Kyle began leaving notes, folded scraps of paper tucked beneath a sanded plank or slipped into her hand during a tool check. Layla collected them with a thief's caution, her heart racing as she hid them in her pocket. At home, under the dim light of her kitchen lamp, she unfolded each one, tracing his slanted handwriting. The notes were simple at first, sketches of a melody's notes, a line about the river's flow, but they grew bolder, words that spoke of longing, of a world beyond bars. She kept them in a tin box under her bed, a secret hoard that anchored her to him. In return, she broke rules she had once upheld without question. A magazine slipped into his workbench, a pack of cigarettes left in a drawer, small acts of rebellion that thrilled and terrified her. Layla's reports became a careful dance of deception. She adjusted timestamps, extended Kyle's workshop hours, claiming delays in projects to justify his presence. Her pen moved with precision, crafting a paper trail that hid their overlap. She grew adept at dodging scrutiny, her excuses polished when supervisors questioned late logs. Yet the effort wore on her, a constant balancing act between duty and desire. She felt alive in ways she hadn't imagined, her days colored by the thrill of their secret. But a shadow of dread crept in. Each note she took, each rule she bent, tightened a noose she couldn't see. Martha Reed, the prison psychologist, watched Layla with growing unease. In the staff room, where officers traded complaints over lukewarm coffee, Martha noted Layla's absence from their banter. She had become a ghost among her colleagues, slipping in and out with a distracted air. One afternoon, Martha caught Layla alone, her eyes scanning a clipboard with an intensity that seemed misplaced. Martha's concern sharpened as she observed the faint tremor in Layla's hands, the way her gaze darted to the door as if expecting interruption. She approached Layla later, her words measured, urging vigilance in a place that preyed on weakness. Layla nodded, her face a mask of agreement, but her thoughts were elsewhere, replaying the warmth of Kyle's hand against hers. Edwin Crow, the head warden, began to notice discrepancies. A log entry here, a schedule shift there, small errors that might have gone overlooked in a less disciplined facility. He summoned Layla to his office one humid morning, his desk cluttered with reports. His questions were direct, probing the gaps in her paperwork, but Layla deflected with practiced ease, blaming fatigue and the workshop's chaotic pace. Crow's eyes narrowed, but he let her go with a warning to tighten her records. She left his office, her pulse pounding, aware that her lies were piling up, each one a crack in the facade she maintained. Kyle's demeanor shifted subtly as the weeks passed. His notes grew more insistent, laced with hints of a future he painted in vivid strokes. A life where they could walk free, where music and rivers replaced bars and concrete. He spoke of plans, vague outlines of something bigger, but never lingered on specifics. Layla absorbed his words, her heart clinging to the dream, but a flicker of doubt stirred. She noticed moments when his warmth cooled, when his smile seemed too deliberate, as if calculated for effect. He asked for favors now, extra time in the workshop, a tool left unchecked, and she complied, driven by the need to hold him close, even as her instincts whispered caution. Layla's nights grew restless. She lay awake in her apartment, the tin box of notes a weight beside her bed. The prison's rules, once her foundation, felt like chains she had chosen to break. She saw Kyle in every shadow, the curve of his shoulder, the cadence of his hum, and the thought of him consumed her. Yet fear gnawed at her, a quiet voice warning that she was slipping too far, that the line between officer and accomplice was blurring. She pushed it down, telling herself their connection was worth the risk, that Kyle's promises were real. But as she stood in the workshop each day, watching him carve wood with a focus that mirrored her own obsession, she couldn't shake the sense that she was falling into a trap she had helped build. As autumn settled over Leflore County, a chill crept into the air, sharpening the prison's edges. Layla moved through her shifts with a heaviness she couldn't shake, her body betraying her in ways she hadn't expected. Fatigue clung to her like damp cloth, her limbs sluggish despite restless nights. A fever came and went, leaving her flushed and unsteady, and a faint rash bloomed across her arms, its irregular patches a puzzle she dismissed as irritation from the workshop's dust. She told herself it was stress, the weight of secrecy, the constant vigilance required to hide her connection with Kyle. But the symptoms lingered, gnawing at her denial. One overcast morning, Layla sat in the waiting room of a clinic in Greenwood, her uniform traded for a plain sweater to avoid questions. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with a clipped manner, delivered the results of her blood work with clinical precision. The word HIV hit Layla like a physical blow, her breath catching as the room seemed to tilt. The doctor explained the timeline. Recent exposure, likely within months, and outlined treatment options, her voice a distant hum against the roar in Layla's mind. She drove home in a daze, the Mississippi roads blurring past, her thoughts circling one truth. Kyle had been her only partner. The realization settled like poison, twisting her memories of his touch into something sinister. Back in her apartment, Layla sat at her kitchen table, staring at the tin box that held Kyle's notes. She didn't open it, couldn't bear to see his words now. Instead, she replayed every moment, their stolen encounters, his promises of a shared future, the way he had looked at her with what she thought was devotion. The betrayal cut deeper than she had imagined, each recollection tainted by the knowledge that he had known, had chosen silence. She felt exposed, her trust shattered, her body now a battleground for a war she hadn't consented to fight. Anger simmered beneath her shock, a slow burn that threatened to consume her. Determined to confirm her suspicions, Layla took a risk she hadn't dared before. During a quiet shift, she slipped into the prison's medical office, where a night orderly, swayed by a discreet payment, left her alone with the files. Her hands trembled as she pulled Kyle's record, the pages detailing routine checks and medications. There, buried in the notes, was the confirmation: a positive HIV diagnosis logged years before, managed with pills he took daily. He had known, had carried the truth through every whispered promise, every touch. She closed the file, her vision swimming, and left the office before anyone could notice, her resolve hardening into something cold and sharp. In the workshop the next day, Layla watched Kyle from a distance, her clipboard a shield against the storm inside her. He worked as always, sanding a table with steady hands, his head bowed in concentration. She approached his bench, her steps deliberate, and stood close enough to see the faint sweat on his neck. For a moment she wanted him to look up, to see the accusation in her eyes, but he kept his gaze down, his focus unbroken. The avoidance was its own confession, a silent admission that fueled her rage. She turned away, her fingers tightening around her pen, the weight of his deception settling deeper. Layla's thoughts grew darker, spiraling into plans she barely recognized as her own. She imagined confronting him, forcing him to admit what he had done. But the prison's walls made that impossible. Any outburst would expose her, unravel the life she had built. She saw her future in fragments, the shame of discovery, the loss of her job, the whispers that would follow her diagnosis. The fear was suffocating, but it was her anger that took root, whispering that Kyle couldn't be allowed to destroy her. She began to study the workshop's routines with new purpose, noting the tools, the schedules, the gaps in surveillance. A plan formed, vague but relentless, driven by a need to reclaim control. Her colleagues noticed the change, though they couldn't name it. In the staff room, where officers swapped stories to pass the time, Layla sat apart, her eyes distant. One guard remarked on her quietness, mistaking it for exhaustion, but others sensed something deeper, a withdrawal that left her untouchable. Martha Reed, the psychologist, watched her closely, her intuition sharpened by years of reading people. She saw the tension in Layla's shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted when she thought no one was looking. Martha tried to approach her once, lingering after a shift, but Layla deflected, her smile tight, her words clipped. She couldn't afford connection now, not when her mind was consumed with survival. Layla's nights became a battleground. Sleep eluded her, her apartment a cage where thoughts of Kyle festered. She saw his face in every shadow, the curve of his jaw, the slant of his smile, and hated herself for the longing that lingered despite her fury. The tin box remained unopened, its contents a reminder of her blindness. She paced her small living room, the hum of cicadas outside a mocking echo of the melodies Kyle once hummed. Her anger grew sharper, honed by the betrayal, and with it came clarity. She would end this, protect herself, bury the truth he had forced upon her. The workshop with its tools and shadows offered a way, and she clung to that thought, letting it guide her through the haze of her fear. Winter's first breath swept through Leflore County, frosting the prison's windows and sharpening the air with a bitter edge. Layla moved through her days with a single-minded focus, her thoughts consumed by the plan that had taken shape in the wake of her betrayal. She had chosen her moment with care, studying the prison's rhythms until she knew them as well as her own heartbeat. The storage room, a cluttered annex off the workshop where tools and materials were kept, became her target. Its dim corners and faulty wiring left it blind to cameras, a rare oversight in the facility's surveillance web. She had walked its aisles countless times, memorizing the shelves, the stacks of lumber, the heavy tools that hung in orderly rows, each one a potential instrument. Layla's preparation was meticulous, driven by a clarity that drowned out her fear. She altered the duty log with a steady hand, her pen tracing false entries that placed Derek Moss, an inmate known for his volatile temper, in the storage room during the evening shift. Moss had clashed with Kyle weeks earlier, a shouting match in the chow hall that had drawn attention. The incident was fresh enough to cast suspicion, a convenient thread she wove into her deception. She checked the log twice, ensuring her handwriting matched the hurried scrawl of her usual reports, then tucked it away, her pulse steady despite the weight of what she was about to do. That evening, as the prison settled into its nighttime routine, Layla volunteered for a final check of the workshop area. The other officers, eager to end their shifts, waved her off without question. The corridors were quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights a faint drone above her. She reached the storage room just as the last inmates were being escorted back to their cells, the space empty except for Kyle. He worked alone, sorting tools under a single bulb that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. His back was to her, his movements unhurried, a familiar melody rising softly from his throat. The sound, once a comfort, now grated against her nerves, fueling the anger that had simmered for weeks. Layla stepped inside, her boots silent on the dust-strewn floor, her clipboard held loosely as a prop. She scanned the room, confirming its emptiness, her eyes settling on a hammer that rested on a nearby shelf. Its handle was worn, its head heavy with years of use, unremarkable among the other tools. She paused, her breath shallow, the weight of her decision pressing against her chest. Kyle didn't turn, didn't sense her approach, his focus lost in the task before him. Her fingers closed around the hammer, the wood cool and solid in her grip. For a moment she hesitated, her mind flashing to his sketches, his notes, the lies that had bound her to him. Then rage surged, silencing doubt, and she raised the hammer with a trembling hand. The first blow struck Kyle's temple, a dull thud that echoed in the stillness. He crumpled instantly, his body folding to the floor. The melody cut short. Layla stood frozen, the hammer still raised, her breath ragged. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and spreading, a stark contrast to the concrete's gray. She acted on instinct, swinging again, then a third time, each strike a release of the fury that had consumed her. The hammer grew slick in her hands, but she tightened her grip, her movements mechanical now, driven by a need to ensure he wouldn't rise. When she stopped, her chest heaved, the silence deafening in the wake of violence. Layla's mind snapped into focus, her training taking over where emotion faltered. She knelt beside the hammer, wiping its handle with a rag from the shelf, erasing her touch. She placed it back exactly where she had found it, aligning it with the other tools as if it had never been moved. Her eyes darted to her uniform, searching for stains, but the dark fabric hid any trace of blood. She stepped back, scanning the scene, her heart pounding as she memorized every detail. The angle of Kyle's body, the tools undisturbed, the blood confined to a small radius. Satisfied, she slipped out of the storage room, closing the door softly behind her. She rejoined the other officers in the main corridor, her face composed, her clipboard tucked under her arm. The prison's routine enveloped her, a shield against suspicion. She nodded to a colleague, her expression neutral, and joined a group heading to the control room. An hour later, a shout broke the calm. An inmate on cleanup duty had found the body. Sirens wailed, lights flared, and the prison erupted into controlled chaos. Layla stood among the officers, her posture rigid, as medics rushed past and supervisors barked orders. She watched the scene unfold, her pulse a steady drumbeat beneath her calm exterior, her mind replaying each step to ensure she had left no trace. The investigation began swiftly, led by Detective Roy Hayes, a stocky man with a reputation for thoroughness. He arrived as the storage room was cordoned off, his notebook already open. Layla observed him from the edge of the crowd, her face blending with the other officers. Hayes moved methodically, his eyes lingering on the hammer, its surface too clean for a weapon that had ended a life. He flipped through the duty log, his brow furrowing at the neat entry for Derek Moss. The timing too precise, the handwriting too deliberate. Layla felt his gaze sweep the room, impersonal but piercing, and she turned away, joining a count of inmates to steady her nerves. Inside, her heart raced, but she held her mask firmly in place, trusting the prison's chaos to bury her secret. The investigation tightened its grip on the prison, each day peeling back layers of routine to expose the cracks beneath. Detective Roy Hayes moved with relentless precision, his presence a quiet storm in the corridors of Leflore County's facility. He began with Kyle's cell, a sparse cube that held more secrets than its bare walls suggested. Beneath a loose panel under the bunk, he uncovered a small bundle of notes, folded tightly and bound with a scrap of cloth. The papers, creased and worn, carried Layla's handwriting, brief requests, coded hints of their meetings, fragments that spoke of intimacy cloaked in caution. A forensic analyst confirmed the match, tying her to the words with clinical certainty, and Hayes felt the case shift, a puzzle piece snapping into place. Martha Reed, the prison psychologist, offered her observations with a heavy reluctance, her notes painting a portrait of Layla's unraveling. In recent months, she had seen the officer withdraw, her once steady demeanor fracturing under an unseen weight. Martha recalled moments of distraction, Layla's eyes darting to shadows, her hands restless during breaks. The psychologist had sensed a breaking point, but lacked the evidence to act, and now her insights fed Hayes's growing suspicion. He interviewed other officers, their responses guarded, shaped by loyalty to a colleague. Yet bit by bit, they revealed patterns. Layla's long hours in the workshop, her silence in the staff room, the way she seemed to carry an invisible burden. Hayes dug deeper, pulling medical records from the prison's archives. A discreet inquiry confirmed Layla's recent diagnosis, a detail that sharpened the motive he had begun to suspect. The betrayal, the fear of exposure, the personal cost, it all pointed to a woman pushed beyond reason. He studied the duty logs again, the entry for Derek Moss standing out like a forged signature, too neat against the chaos of a prison's paperwork. The hammer, wiped clean and returned to its shelf, gnawed at him, a killer's arrogance or a desperate attempt to erase guilt. Each clue built a case that circled Layla, her shadow lengthening across the evidence. The interrogation came on a gray morning, the room stark under flickering lights. Layla sat across from Hayes, her posture rigid, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He laid out the evidence with measured calm, the notes, the logs, the medical file, each item a stone in the wall closing around her. She held his gaze at first, her face a mask of defiance, but the weight of facts eroded her resolve. Her fingers trembled, betraying the cracks in her composure. And when Hayes pressed on the note's intimacy, she faltered. The confession spilled out in fragments, her voice low, as if speaking it aloud made it real. She admitted to the hammer, the strikes, the desperate need to bury a secret that threatened to ruin her. Her words carried the sting of betrayal, the pain of a trust shattered, but Hayes saw no remorse for the act itself, only for the life it had cost her. The trial unfolded swiftly in a Greenwood courtroom, its wooden benches filled with locals drawn by the scandal. Layla stood before the judge, her uniform replaced by a plain gray dress, her shoulders squared in a habit born of years in authority. The prosecutor dismantled her defenses with surgical precision, presenting the notes as proof of a forbidden bond, the logs as evidence of deceit, the hammer as the final verdict of her guilt. Martha testified, her voice steady but laced with sorrow, describing Layla's descent into obsession. Officers took the stand, their accounts hesitant, painting a woman who had drifted from their ranks. Hayes outlined the investigation, his testimony a dry recitation of facts that left no room for doubt. Layla's defense leaned on her emotional turmoil, arguing that desperation, not malice, had driven her. The attorney painted Kyle as a manipulator, a man who had exploited her vulnerability, but the jury remained unmoved. The evidence was too stark, the act too deliberate. After a brief deliberation, the verdict came, guilty of murder, with a sentence of 18 years. Layla listened without reaction, her face impassive as the gavel fell. She was transferred to a women's prison in a neighboring county, a facility as grim as the one she had left. There, among strangers, she blended into the ranks of inmates, but her measured steps and upright posture marked her as someone who had once held keys, not worn chains. In Leflore's prison, Layla's story took on a life of its own. New officers heard it whispered during training, a cautionary tale of boundaries crossed and trust betrayed. Veterans shook their heads, their memories of her fading into the prison's endless churn. Martha Reed continued her work, her eyes lingering longer on the staff, searching for signs of fracture. Hayes filed his report and moved to the next case, but a restlessness lingered, a sense that some piece of Layla's motive remained just out of reach. He drove past the Mississippi River on his way home, its current steady and indifferent, carrying no answers for those caught in its shadow. The prison stood as it always had, its walls absorbing her story into the countless others etched within, while Layla, now a number in another ledger, faced the years ahead, her past a weight she could neither shed nor reclaim.